defendants. Now, Martina Devlin is with us. She's a columnist with the Irish Independent and an author. Martina, this case, obviously, rather than talk about the specifics of it, because we don't want to get ourselves in too much trouble, it throws up a whole heap of issues about the legal system. And I understand there are significant differences between the legal system in the north and the legal system here, but not that many, really, when it comes down to the experience of complainants / victims. But it also raises significant issues around team sports and how men behave in private groups when they're talking about women. And it also raises the issue of consent and just how ill-equipped Irish people are when it comes to talking about consent, asking for consent, and it would seem in understanding that consent has been withheld.
Well, look, we're all flies on the locker room wall now, aren't we? And the way that men think about women and talk about women is really deeply unsettling. And I should say it's not all men, but it seems, in fact, it's not even the majority of men, I believe, but it seems to be not unusual among some very highly pumped sportsmen. And what I notice is you come across things like this in soccer and in rugby, where you don't have too many female participants, but it's not a situation you hear about in terms of, say, sports like tennis or sailing, where lots of women compete. So is that something? Is it that it's young men together in a pack mentality, not interacting very much with women, except then in these social settings where they have celebrity status?
I guess one of the other things is that most sports ask their teams to behave with a pack mentality. They ask them to have a singularity of vision. They ask them to have a togetherness and, let's all die for the team. And that's grand, that's great on the field of play. It's actually a really positive thing that you can get a bunch of people together, unified behind something, but...
Sure, but the pack mentality is not a good modus operandi in life, and we know that in Ireland if nobody else does. Put on the green jersey for Ireland. I mean, the whole banking collapse hinged on the pack mentality.
How do we stop it?
Education, and it has to start in the home. And communication. But one of the issues is alcohol, and we know the enormous levels of alcohol that were consumed in this instance. Alcohol is consumed in really, really high levels generally socially in Ireland. We have a very Jekyll and Hyde attitude towards drink. And the problem with excessive alcohol is it affects your communication skills, it affects your comprehension skills, and it affects your forward thinking skills.
Yeah.
So, if look, you talk to any taxi driver and they'll say that when someone with a lot of drink gets into their car, the hardest thing is actually finding out which address to bring them to. They can't even express that. So in social situations, that level of alcohol is really, really problematic. But yes, just going back to what you're saying, the home is where it has to start. People have to be taught to have respect for others. And I think it's increasingly difficult for parents because of, look, every smartphone, you can turn it on and see anything on it. And there's a blurring of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable.
Generations have become inured to sexual violence through pornography.
Yes, totally, and at a very young age. Look, you can see an execution online if you want. You can see pretty much anything. And of course the other problem, I think, is bragging rights. And again, you get that with these young men, where the idea of having something to boast about after the weekend matters more than thinking, was I respectful here?
Yeah. This seems to be, certainly the conversation we're having is that life is heading one direction. And in the aftermath of a high-profile case like this, it's hard not to be very concerned about the direction that our collective society is heading. But we surely have the power and the capability to have conversations about this type of stuff and begin to engineer a future for us as a collective that's better than the direction we seem to be going?
Well, look, it does need to hinge on consent, and I think the problem is conversations aren't even happening around consent, and we need to understand, all of us, that consent can be withdrawn at any time of an encounter. I do think that the universities are recognising this and are holding classes and are particularly for first years, because they're conscious that people are going from secondary school, where you're quite sheltered, to third level education. There's alcohol.
And can you believe there was a massive outcry and a controversy about the fact that consent classes were going to be held in Trinity? I remember they were going to make them, it was like mandatory consent classes. No.
Well,
they weren't. This.
I think it was the word mandatory was the issue. People were strongly recommended to go, but you can't really make it mandatory, because if someone is there because they're under the cosh to be there, are they even going to listen? You do need willing participation in a class like that. But it's just so that people understand respect and dignity. Look, let me give you an analogy. If you have a laptop and you fill it full of bad code, you're never going to get very good use out of that laptop. And it's the same with human beings. It's the messages they absorb. And I think the problem with some young men, because I don't think it's the majority and I don't think it's the norm, okay? I think the problem with some young men is that they just, it's more important to them to be able to put up a WhatsApp message saying, we're all top shaggers, as we heard in the Belfast trial, than, you know what, I was with a girl and we held hands, or we swapped phone numbers. Things have gone from 0 to 90 very fast, but I probably sound like my granny saying that. I mean, like, just to totally change the tone, my Auntie Molly, who is my father's eldest sister, so the matriarch of the family, remembers when she was engaged to her husband, walking down the street holding his hand, and the priest stopping her and saying, that is unacceptable behaviour. So we have changed so enormously in a short space of time, in some ways for the better, okay, because we're not tugging the forelock, all right? And people aren't stigmatised and marginalised because of sexual behaviour, which is perfectly normal.
But no doubt the conversations that parents are having with kids haven't morphed at the same speed as society has changed. I think
the internet and the ease of access of images and the blurring of is this right? Is this acceptable? I think these are issues.
Just on the consent classes, you mentioned at university level, that's obviously everything should start from a top-down approach, but it's clearly too late, because quite often people are coming to university from an ingrained culture, quite often in this country from an all-boys school, where their mentality is quite fixated. And is it possible to change that? And I guess it goes without saying that university is too late, but as I say, you have to start somewhere.
Well, sure, and you have to start in the home, really. And I do think that parents, need to know what their kids are looking at on the mobile phones and on the laptops. Yeah, it is wonderful. The internet is a wonderful tool. It's made the world a smaller place. So let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Sure. I guess as well, though, you mentioned at the top being the fly on the locker room wall, and that fly may say the language that I've overheard in the locker room is like Stone Age caveman talk, to use the cliche. But in actual fact, is it the very definition of 21st century talk, given what you've just outlined? The content at the tip of your fingers, the smartphone generation are now adults.
Well, I wonder if we're thinking less. We're better educated than ever before. More and more people have access to third level education. But are we thinking about things? And we know that from the soundbite generation. I mean, I work in newspapers. Do people, how many people read to the end of an article? They look at the headlines, because that's the smartphone notion of flick, and how much are you absorbing? And also it's the echo chamber of social media, where you're getting your news from sites where you know what's on them, and you go along what with the viewpoints there. You're not challenging your own preconceptions. So if you're in this pack where your friends all feel the same way about the opposite sex, is there is there any way for that to be penetrated, for you to say, well, for someone to say to you, that's not acceptable, that's not even nice?
No is the answer, right? And
sure.
so that's the issue.
Sure, it is the issue. But look, at least we're having the conversation, aren't we?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously under pretty horrific circumstances.
Horrific for everybody. I mean, with that Belfast case, I know we don't want to go into the specifics, but there are no winners. There are no winners there.
I do wonder, like, about what happens next. Like, this conversation happens. These conversations are happening. Like, it is literally the first time that I remember any story where everywhere you go, everybody is talking about it. And that has been non-stop for, I would say, the last 8 weeks. Like, literally, we did a show in New York, and every Irish person we met was talking to us about this case. We've been to London at the rugby weekend, and everybody Irish person wants to know what the story was. And it's not just rugby people, it's GAA people, it's everybody, it's every taxi you get into. And so, is the conversation happening because the details of the case are so widely reported and so prurient, and we in the South are so unused to that? Or is it because people are beginning to wake up to the notion that modern day relationships between men and women are complicated, and it's about time we all had a let's get back to fundamentals and go, how do we define these things, and how do we understand them, and how do we actually make sure that the collective understanding is according respect to people and is actually based on a fundamental humanity towards each other?
Well, I suppose we are unaccustomed to that avalanche of sordid detail. And I think as well we're unaccustomed to being inside the mindset of quite a privileged group of young men. In theory, these guys were educated and from a comfortable background, well-spoken, and you might presume would have respect for the opposite sex and for older people and for all sorts of groups. One would presume that when you have that level of advantage in life, you might look on people with from a certain perspective, and we saw not back into that locker room wall. I mean, every person I've spoken to, male and female, what they come back to is the WhatsApp messages, the spit roasting, the top shaggers, the merry-go-round. That language really is jaw-dropping. But look, you two are guys. Would you say this is normal?
No, I wouldn't say.
I would hope it isn't.
And yet, it's not stuff that you wouldn't have seen at various stages. Like, there's definitely and you pick your mates. Like, you don't hang around with people who speak like that. And sometimes you step in and go, "Shut up," and then sometimes you go, "I'm just going to keep reading my phone here." But it's not unheard of, I would say. I wouldn't say that it's a tiny coterie of people.
Well, it can't be normalised.
No,
it can't be normalised, and perhaps if there's a lesson for society from this, it's that was this in danger of becoming more widespread than we would like, and let's stop it, let's address it. There was a campaign running in England which I thought was very interesting, which compared consent to a cup of tea. Okay, now on the face of it that sounds silly, but think about it. If you offer someone a cup of tea and they say, no, you don't really, Mrs. Doyle apart, say, go on, go on, go on, you accept they don't want a cup of tea. And if 5 minutes later they say, you know what, I've changed my mind, I would fancy a drop, you don't think, whoa, that person, they're so inconsistent. All right, now, apply that to sexual relations. people can withdraw consent at any time, and that's the message that has to be taken from this. Young men have to understand that at any stage of the proceedings, a girl can say no. But equally, perhaps girls have to understand that they have to communicate what they're thinking. And again, that brings us back to the alcohol. High levels of alcohol affect your communication skills and your comprehension skills.
Completely. Just on that point then, when it comes to the withdrawal of consent, I guess ultimately the initial point from a male perspective anyway should be that I guess consent has to be given in an enthusiastic manner. I guess waiting for the withdrawal, there's a danger there in itself, is there not?
Sure, I mean, but look, none of us were in that bedroom, that's the problem. And I think one of the things that comes out of it is the judicial system lets people down. I keep thinking, for example, and this is, everybody's entitled to a defence, but that girl in the witness box with 4 QCs challenging her version of events, which of course they had to do. Of course they had to do. Everybody's entitled to a defence, but just the system, the way it happens, what woman would put herself through that? This has got to impact on numbers making complaints about sex crimes. It has to, because even if you 100% believe that that you were raped, are you going to go through that?
And put yourself through it? Definitely not.
So, and I think a case has to be made, and that applies to both jurisdictions, for the complainant to have separate legal representation, because you can't presume that the prosecutor will always represent your interests.
It makes perfect sense to have that, because it was referred to on radio last night as a swearing match between he said, she said. But ultimately, if it's he said, she said, he mostly, in 98% of the cases, has legal representation. Mm-hmm. The state is separate, and then you're over there on your own. That makes no sense.
Yeah, you're on your own. And the adversarial system is such that the lawyers for the defence are highly motivated to pick holes in everything you say and to cast doubt, to question everything from the level of alcohol you consumed to what you were wearing to your sexual history. Everything is in there. And that's in the interests of a rigorous and robust defence.
I saw a really interesting piece. There was the case in America last year, or maybe it was 2016, of the guy who got 6 months for sexually assaulting a comatose woman. He was interrupted by 2 cyclists, so there was eyewitnesses to it. And the judge had said, you're guilty, I'm going to sentence you now, and I'm giving you 6 months though, because you've got your whole life ahead of you and I don't want to ruin your life. And I think it was Ro McDermott in her piece was talking about how the language, or maybe it was Sarah Griffin, one of them was making the point that the language about the victim is always her past and what she has done to put herself in this situation, and the language about the perpetrator is always about the impact this is going to have on his future. And it's completely I understand
unbalanced.
It's completely unbalanced. I understand we're supposed to have an innocent until proven guilty, but that you jeopardize your future by putting yourself in the situation where you are a rapist or you are sexually aggressive.
Well, and it's an awful label to carry about, for life. If it's a pretty shocking thing. So it's right that a person has a strong defence, and it's right the system of innocent until proven guilty. Nobody's questioning that. But sex crimes are held to a different standard, and it's part of our 2-tier morality. And we've seen this 2-tier morality in all the discussion around the Belfast case. But with a sex crime, it's always, well, what was the woman wearing? Why did she walk home rather than, get a taxi? So that someone approached her and attacked her. How did her behaviour lead to her being attacked?
Yeah.
Okay? Now, you don't get that with burglary, with a house break-in.
When you say the 2-tier morality, we just tease that out. What do you mean?
Well, girls were always taught, and I think subliminally are still taught that it's their behaviour which impacts on men. So the idea is that men can't help themselves, it's biology, they're highly motivated to reproduce, that's how the human species has continued. And it's up to women to say, stop, this isn't right, you know, I don't go along with that. Rather than it being two people, you know, who have to take responsibility for what happens. And so you see that, for example, with the description of Belfast, where, look, I think any young girl, any girl, any woman has to take from the Belfast case. Don't go into nightclubs. Don't go into the VIP section. Don't go where there are famous sportsmen, because people will say, and definitely don't talk to them or don't recognise them, because it will be used as defence that you were flirting. If you talk to them, you're flirting, and if you show that you recognise them, it's described as you stared at them, and it's just the he says, she says takes a particular twist.
That's the two-tier morality, really.
Yeah, exactly. That's the two-tier morality.
I guess separately from this case and with rape cases in general, it's kind of almost an academic term, but it's certainly come up a lot over the last 24 hours, and it is the real rape stereotype. And you look at the statistics where the majority of rape convictions are from the complainant bringing a case against somebody who they know.
Yes.
And this real rape stereotype, this, I guess, dark alley, shady character jumping upon a victim is what I'm talking about here, just to break it down into completely blunt terms. And I guess there's an attitude towards that. Is there? Would you agree with that? That we still hold that view of rape, that it is the...
That rape is a stranger.
Precisely.
No, people are raped by those they know. I mean, but sure, marital rape was regarded as impossible for so many years, and that was a huge sea change when it was accepted that within marriage, a woman has a right to say no.
Yeah.
Our attitudes have shifted.
I mean, here's the thing, though. It almost never gets prosecuted. Like, we changed the statute books, but it seems that sometimes... I mean, maybe that's important, maybe that's symbolic, and maybe that helps to signify things. Just to go back to the consent issue, right, you definitely parents have to have full responsibility for this. But is it time we just stick it on the curriculum in primary school and go, this is something you're all going to learn as 6-year-olds, and we're just going to say this to you. No means no. And...
Yeah, well, you can teach little kids the difference between yes and no and expressing their views. I mean, probably you couldn't really get down to the birds and the bees
but
at the
you don't
age
have
of
to
6.
really, because it's...
I remember I have a little nephew who, when we laughed about it, but it made sense too, where there was what you could loosely call toddler assertiveness training, where in kindergarten they were trying to, some little kids were more robust than others and some felt slightly bullied, and they were teaching these 2 and 3 and 4-year-olds to say no, and the way they did it was they said, hold up your finger, do it like this, no, when Rosie wants you to get out of the sandpit and let her in. Just hold the finger up and say no. Now, of course, why we laughed about it was he came home from kindergarten, and at bedtime when his mother said, okay, time for bed, he'd go, no, with the finger up. But it, you know, it does work,
yeah.
That visual signal. So, but it's all down to communication, isn't it? You know, the odd thing is we're better than ever at communication, because of social media and Twitter, and up to a point.
Yeah.
Bear with me here, okay? So we're very good at the sharp phrase, but we're not drilling down beneath it. And are we even really listening? We're ticking likes. We're doing those little hearts and little, you know, likes on social media. But if we even bothered reading through the whole item...
It might change your mind. Martina, thanks very much for coming in studio.
I think it's a pleasure.
It's definitely a topic that we felt was worth covering this morning.